haven't been here before, we have a wonderful author program, and because of the topic tonight, we've got some authors that I think you may be interested in, and you will see as you leave, or our folks may corner you and give you sheets like this. They will tell you that we have an author, a program like a Monday, Rap on Trial. We have The Fire is Upon Us, James Baldwin and William Buckley, and the debate over race in America that's coming on March 24th. Overturning Brown versus Board of Education decision on the 31st of March. The Other Madisons, about President James Madison and the black side of his family. Even the Shadow System, which is about young black men in prison. And Wes Moore is coming back in April. He's got a book that's coming out called 5 Days. It's about when Freddie Gray is killed and everything that happens after that. So make sure you get one of these sheets or go to our website, because it's a wonderful program, and I think you'll enjoy it just as much as tonight. The other thing is, you'll see on one of the tables out there some surveys for a government agency, okay? National Archives and Records Administration loves to know what you think about these programs. It's a front and back thing. I don't care if you put anything on the back. Really, all I care about is the top, that you're here, that you enjoyed the program, and it was everything that you wanted, and you want to come back and do it. So that will make the National Archives happy, and when they're happy, I'm happy. I am especially happy to work again with Andre Gillespie. We have worked together before on programs like this. She's Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute for Study of Race and Difference at Emory University. She teaches courses on American politics and race. She's the author of 3 books, including Race and the Obama Administration, Symbols, Substance, and Hope. And she is going to lead us into a fabulous discussion tonight. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Gillespie.
Thank you so much, Ken, for that introduction, and thank you for being with us. I am always honored that people are willing to come out on Friday night to talk about a really important and heady subject matter. Today's theme is provocative and timely. It's also long overdue. And so we are going to have a really interesting discussion tonight. Before I begin, I want to tell you a little bit about the James Weldon Johnson Institute. JWJI is a comprehensive research center at Emory that's dedicated to the study of race and difference. In addition to hosting research fellowships for undergraduate, graduate, and postdoctoral fellows, we're also committed to public programs like this, which bring the Emory community together with the Atlanta community. So in addition to these evening programs, we hosted weekly lunchtime colloquium series on campus. We invite you all to attend these programs, and there's more information available outside. Also, please join us. We do 4 of these evening events a year, and our last event in our public dialogue series is going to be on April 9th, all on Emory's campus in Cannon Chapel, and there our featured speaker is going to be Harvard historian Evelyn Brooks. I also want to give a shout of thanks out to my staff, Rhonda Patrick, who's in the back, Antoinette Burrell, and Crystal Wright, who this program wouldn't have come together without their help, so please join me in thanking them. And so let me introduce our panel. So I'm going to start closest to me, and I'm going to work my way back. So Dr. Megan Francis is Visiting Associate Professor of Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School and Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Washington. Francis specializes in the study of American politics with broad interest in criminal punishment, Black political activism, philanthropy, and the post-Civil War South. She is the author of the award-winning book Civil Rights and the Making of the Modern American State, which tells the story about how the early campaign against state-sanctioned racial violence that was taken up by the NAACP shaped the modern civil rights movement. Francis marshals an extensive archival analysis to show that the battle against lynching and mob violence in the first quarter of the 20th century was pivotal to the development of civil rights and the growth of federal court power. She's currently at work on a second book project that examines the role of convict policing in the rebuilding of Southern political power and modern capitalism after the Civil War. A proud alumna of the Seattle Public Schools, Rice University, she earned her PhD in politics from Princeton University. Next to her is Dr. Nafees Kahn is Assistant Professor of Social Foundations at Clemson University. He earned his PhD here at Emory in Educational Studies and his BA in Sociology with a minor in History from Tufts. His research interests incorporate the legacies of slavery as related to education and the experiences of African diaspora communities. He served on the Executive Committee for Slave Voyages, the Transatlantic Slave Database, which many people have used to be able to trace their ancestry to the point at which they came over in the Middle Passage. Awesome. In addition, he is on the Planning and Advisory Committee of the African Diaspora Consortium, where he is one of the developers of the new Advanced Placement Seminar course on the African diaspora with the College Board. To his left is Dr.Darrick Hamilton. Dr. Hamilton is Executive Director of the Kahn Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at the Ohio State University. In addition, Dr. Hamilton holds a primary faculty appointment in the John Glenn College of Public Affairs with courtesy appointments in the Departments of Economics and Sociology in the College of Arts and Sciences. Professor Hamilton is a pioneer and internationally recognized scholar in the field of stratification economics, which uses social science methods to examine the causes, consequences, and remedies of racial, gender, ethnic, tribal, and nativity inequality in education, economic, and health outcomes. This work involves crafting and implementing innovative routes and policies that break down social hierarchy, empower people, and move society towards greater inclusion, equity, and civic participation. Born and raised in the Bedford-Stuyvesant section of Brooklyn, he now resides in the short north section of Columbus, Ohio. He received his undergraduate degree from Oberlin College and his PhD in economics from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Next to him is Dr. Melissa Nobles. Dr. Nobles is the Keenan Sahin Dean of the School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences, and a professor of political science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Nobles' research and teaching have focused on the comparative study of racial and ethnic politics and issues of retrospective justice. Her current research centers on constructing a database of racial killings in the American South from 1930 to 1954. She's working closely with a faculty collaborator and advisory board member of the Northeastern Law School Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Law Clinic. She has conducted extensive archival research, unearthed, understudied, and more often unknown deaths, and contributing to legal investigations. She's the author of 2 books, Shades of Citizenship, Race and the Census in Modern Politics, and The Politics of Official Apologies. She's also co-editor. She's also co-editor with Jun Hyuk Kwak of Inherited Responsibility and Historical Reconciliation in East Asia. Her scholarship has also appeared in the Annual Review of Political Science, Dataless, the American Journal of Public Health, and several edited volumes. She is a graduate of Brown University, where she earned her majored in history, and she earned her PhD in political science from Yale. She's had fellowships at Boston University's Institute for Race and Social Division and Harvard's Radcliffe Center for Advanced Study. She's also served on the editorial boards of Polity, the American Political Science Review, and the Perspectives on Politics. She's also been involved in faculty governance at MIT, obviously, but before she was dean, she served as associate chair of the MIT faculty and vice president of the American Political Science Association, in addition to having been chair of the Political Science Department. And last but not least is Emory's own Dr. Alyasah Sewell. They are associate professor of sociology at Emory University and founding director of the Race and Policing Project. Specializing in advancing quantitative approaches to racism studies, they have identified the empirical links between the political economy of race and racial health and healthcare disparities using policing and housing policy data. Published in a wide array of sociological and interdisciplinary outlets, Their research has garnered support and recognition from the National Institutes of Health, the Ford Foundation, the National Science Foundation, the Society for the Study of Social Problems, and the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, in addition to Planned Parenthood Federation of America. They received their undergraduate degree in sociology, summa cum laude from the University of Florida, and their PhD in sociology from Indiana University. All right, so let's start with our discussion. So I want to start with some definitions. What exactly do we mean when we say reparations? Are we talking about 40 acres and a mule? Does it mean cash compensation? So how much? Does it mean affirmative action? So I'm opening this up to everybody, but I'd like to start with Melissa.
Sure. Thanks, Audra. Well, generally, when you think about reparations, it typically means material compensation, monies of some sorts, usually money. Initially, when reparations were discussed, it was in relationship to war, reparations after wars, most famously, obviously, after World War II, but increasingly, arguably too with World War I, which helped cause World War II, but over the course of the 20th century, it expanded to include governments as well as corporate compensation. So it's, while we may think of other things like apologies, which may in some ways be compensatory, those are largely symbolic in certain ways, which may work in tandem with material compensation or compensation. Reparations generally means material, something.
So of the things you cited, it would be all of it except for affirmative action.
Right.
Right. I would say affirmative, all of it plus some, the things you're doing. Right. So affirmative action to me is anti-discriminatory policy aimed at desegregating elites, allowing access to elite stratas for which others might not have had access to. In terms of reparations, I'm just echoing, I would think of it in three components. It would be acknowledgement, it would be redress, and then potentially closure. And that doesn't mean that if discrimination persists, that there are no more claims. But if it's done right, it would mean closure for the atrocities that were committed that is aimed at addressing.
So we can imagine lots of reasons why African Americans would be entitled to reparations. But what for you is the reason for reparations? I'll start with Nafees.
Well, I think part of the reason for it is the legacy of enslavement, captivity, oppression, and repression, right? And it didn't just start one day and then end, and then, all things were washed our hands of it. It continued on in differing forms. And so the conversation also has needed to evolve. Because as was mentioned before, reparations oftentimes was in a direct repayment to the person or the individual or the company or the country that was harmed in some way or that was denigrated in some way, and they needed that regression. But to think about reparations in the context of the legacies of slavery, we have to broaden what that means, and in part because slavery just, in the U.S. context, it took a war to end slavery. The other American countries, the Americas, I should say, with the exception of Haiti, they ended slavery through legislation for the most part. The U.S. and Haiti were the only two that went to war over slavery, which gives a different signal that it wasn't going away, right? And so I think there's something around, it didn't just stop, right? Definitely when the Emancipation Proclamation, but it continues on in different forms. So we have to think about it in a broader way, because it isn't a finite moment or a finite experience, because the effect of it is across generations. It's beyond any one person's lived life, as well as their ancestors' life as well.
I just want to add to that, while it's certainly true that in the Americas, with the exception of Haiti and in the U.S., where the war ended slavery, in none of those countries, whether it ended by war or not, was there any kind of compensation. In fact, after the Haitian Revolution, the expectation was that Haiti would pay the French back. And in fact, part of the claims today of Haiti towards France is to say, give us the money back that we paid you for most of the 19th century for our successful revolution. And arguably, the Haitian Revolution, or all that it could have produced, was thwarted at precisely the time that it it could have prospered because they were forced to pay back France for the loss of property. I mean, Haiti was the most profitable of the Caribbean islands. But that's all to say that there's always resistance when it comes to paying back victims.
And oppression doesn't stop at the end of slavery, either in the U.S. context or the Americas context. Indeed, there is scholarship that suggests that slavery ended in various places because it became less profitable, that there were other economic systems that were more profitable and just as exploitive and extractive. So, I think slavery would be one act of egregiousness, but it continues, and we can cite many others throughout American history.
So let's talk about the transatlantic slave trade. So this may seem like stating the obvious, but what did Black people lose as a result of slavery?
Well, to start with what was lost, I guess, separation of families and separation from communities is one of the multitude of losses, to frame it in that way. And it's stretched beyond just one nation to another nation. It was a global enterprise that lasted hundreds of years, that involved millions and millions, the estimates range, of around 12.5 who were put on boats, over 10 million who survived the voyage. Those are estimates. Right? And that doesn't count the families that were, separated from, that stayed on, or those who didn't survive the first leg of the journey, right, before the middle passage, if you will, the captivity of it, right? So there's the expanse of people and lives that were lost, and the connections between communities, languages, cultures, traditions was tremendous, right? And so I think just thinking about familial connections, I think is one starting place. In addition, I mean, one framing, I guess an economic framing is the loss of potential labor, your own labor. As an individual, you have a potential to, earn your future living, right? And that's stolen by being forced to work for somebody else's benefit. So I think your future is stolen, not just your past and your connection to your family and your community, but also the future. Right? And that goes without saying that the present is stolen because your physical body is being put to work and put to someone else's benefit without your say in that. So I think there are a lot of different ways to think about losses, but I think the connections that were severed, intentionally severed. While the remarkable element is the perseverance through that is something that we also have to kind of hold on to, right? That not despite, but almost in direct contrast and resistance to the formations of new bonds, of differing bonds, right? Across, very diverse peoples, right? Who found themselves in captivity is very much part of that story too. So there's a loss, and I'm not trying to say there's a gain, but there's a survival element to it in this context.
Darrick, can we quantify the unpaid economic contributions of slave labor to the U.S. economy? If so, how do we do that?
The short answer is yes. I mean, the courts every day make economic compensation both narratives and explicit based on harms that have been done to people, whether it is specific harm in terms of not being able to work and recoup one's returns for one's labor or returns on one's asset, but also we compensate for bodily harm. So the answer of can we? Of course we can. Will it completely restore some of the dignity that's lost in a population? The answer is probably no. We can't put a financial cost on it, but we certainly can engage in the calculus of describing the lost revenue, the lost potential revenue, as well as the compensatory redress for bodily harm as well as other types of harm.
And are there some sort of well-known brands or institutions where we can directly correlate their success even today to their participation in the institution of slavery?
So much I agree with in terms of what my fellow panelists have said. One of the things that you just mentioned in your remarks that kind of struck a chord with me was this idea in terms of loss of labor, right? And then just for me thinking, especially as somebody who works basically 1865 to about 1925, that's kind of the historical period, that's my group, it's also a terrible period, right, in the South. But there's so much kind of this loss of labor that happens during enslavement continues right afterwards. And I think part of the reason that it's so important to have this larger discussion about reparations is to continue to think about kind of the way that damages have compounded over time. That when enslavement ended, it didn't just end, and it wasn't that Black people were free, right? But that like their labor was continued taken from them by private individuals, by state governments, by the federal government, and that still happens today. So in the period that I've just as one example out of many, I focus specifically on Alabama, Texas, and Tennessee, and the ways in which the different state governments in the period after enslavement, while the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were being passed, were at the time trying to figure out ways that they can continue to take Black labor, right, for free, basically. And their way, and this is, I think, familiar to many people now, is through a system of convict leasing, right? And so many governments, state governments all across the South, engaged in what we know as Black codes, passed new laws, and practiced a racialized type of policing. And you saw so many of these prison populations in state governments, states in the South, southern states, expand. I mean, it wasn't an equal type of kind of in terms of population expansion, but it was, for example, Mississippi, Alabama, over 90% of the prison population in the post-emancipation era was now Black, right? For the most part, outside of Texas, there were no penitentiaries in the South. They had been demolished by Union troops. And so what happened is that the state also did not have enough money to feed and clothe these individuals. And so it was the fact that corporations and former plantation owners then approached the state and created a bargain, right? Which was that we will house and clothe these individuals, and we will pay you for their labor, and these people will labor for us. And so this was kind of providing a stopgap for many corporations, for many plantations in the South, but it wasn't. I think this is also really important to say that this is not just a story about the South, right? That it wasn't just the South, it was also northern corporations and speculators who were like, what is going on in the South? It's like the wild, wild west. Let's throw some money, let's invest. And this is where you see in terms of a lot of northern companies and Wall Street businessmen investing in railroads across the South that are going to be a lot of the labor being Black laborers who were formerly enslaved people. It's also important in my friends in economics, I've really pushed on this, that it's not just, we only get a kind of part of the picture by focusing on the system of convict leasing, but you have to also examine the ways that a system of convict leasing and new laws also had a different impact on the kind of free wage Black labor as well. And so, of course, in terms of the terrible labor contracts for Black sharecroppers at the time, people who were not engaged or not caught in the criminal punishment system, but yet still had the impact of what was going on. In terms of specifically though to your question, companies that I focus on, because I'm part of my interest here is in trying to trace, right, in terms of companies that we have that are still around today. Imperial Sugar Company, it's in a number of grocery stores still to this day. Is a company that got its start and in terms of its height off of Black laborers in Texas, convict laborers. There's also other companies in terms of Alabama and Texas. So for example, J.P. Morgan, one of the subsidiaries was Tennessee Coal Iron and Railroad Company. And he really was all about wanting to be one of the biggest kind of coal giants in the country. And so obviously J.P. Morgan Chase is still very much around today, right? So there's like, when people are like, oh, we don't know who did it. Yes, you do know. You just don't want to know.
So I'm gonna start this question with So I know many people who may be familiar with Ta-Nehisi Coates' 2014 Atlantic argument for reparations. So interestingly, he doesn't start with 1619. He starts with a Black man born in Mississippi in 1923 who experienced economic exploitation as a boy and as an adult in Chicago. So my question for Ali and then for everyone else is, can you describe the modern day types of discrimination, both de jure and de facto, which could be eligible for reparations?
So I think there are three that I study in my own work. The first one is, and I think we've been talking about, is asset extraction. it's not just that there is a deprivation of income, but also that we have a deprivation of how we make money or build capital based on that income. So if someone goes to school, or someone has a good occupation, or someone buys a home in a nice neighborhood, we're not able to capitalize on that. And that is something that still goes on today. It's something that is more marked in Black neighborhoods, Latino neighborhoods. The second one I'm thinking about is redlining itself. There is actually an issue of redlining in the past, we call it traditional forms of redlining, but also redlining right now, contemporary forms of redlining. Redlining in the past, it was that we were locked out of the mortgage institutions. We could not get assets at all, so we had to use our own quote-unquote capital to raise that aspect to home ownership, which is another form of asset accumulation. And then now, we actually have a situation where we're more likely to be in the mortgage market, but we get unsustainable loans. We call them subprime predatory loans. And these loans both reduce our ability to get asset off of those loans, but also increases the likelihood of default, of foreclosure, and so on and so forth. And it also just costs more. It just costs more. The last one I'm thinking about is something we actually really been talking around, but I think we need to talk about it, is mass incarceration. Not only is there penal labor, where people are getting essentially underpaid for their work, there's also the spillover effects of being formally incarcerated. People are less likely to get jobs, get good jobs, be able to get good homes in good neighborhoods, and so on and so forth. We also have what I study, the illness spillovers of policing or police surveillance, where people, as small as living in a neighborhood where there's a pat down, you have an increased risk of morbidity in the forms of diabetes, asthma episodes, high blood pressure, obesity, and believing that your health is poor or fair. That might not seem something that is very important, but we know from research that in fact, believing that your health is poor or fair is one of the greatest indicators of mortality. So it's not just that policing makes you sick, both through direct contact and living in neighborhoods where policing is high, but also that it increases your risk of mortality.
Thank you for
Say
that.
that again.
My next question, direction with Darrick. We kind of talked about the wealth gap without directly addressing it. So can you please describe the wealth gap and its connections to the conversation?
So the wealth gap is dramatic. The typical Black household has about 10 cents on the dollar as the typical white household. And that's in the context of medians. If we were to look at mean differences, the differences would be even more dramatic. Black people make up about 12% of the population and have about 3% of the nation's wealth. I'd say that wealth is probably an index, a cumulative index of all the racial, actually, it would be probably the best economic indicator of all the cumulative effects of racism and deprivation in economic terms. And I had to qualify that because we have health disparities as well that are dramatic. And what's useful about thinking about wealth in the context of the American meritocracy, I can give you a statistic where I tell you that the typical Black family where the head graduated from college has less wealth than the typical white family who dropped out of high school. So clearly, it is not someone studying hard and working hard as the mechanism to accumulate wealth. The way in which we accumulate wealth is, it is wealth that begets more wealth. That without capital, you basically lock in inequality. And it is getting wealth at a key point when you're a young adult that allows you to get into an asset that's gonna passively accrue over your life. That's how wealth is generated. And Blacks, you might argue that there have been gains with regards to a Black middle class in education, in income, and occupation, but there has never been an American middle class if it's defined in terms of wealth. And that probably becomes the biggest justification, one of the biggest justifications for a reparations argument to, in a retrospective manner, apply justice so that we can account for all the egregiousness that has taken place. One other key thing I'll make to the point is that a lot of that egregious stuff that took place in our history was state complicit. So Megan gave the story of pointing to J.P. Morgan as an example. And They benefited, but the reality is that, and people make the argument, well, I didn't do it, I wasn't racist, but your state did. Your state is responsible for all this egregiousness that took place and injustice, not just in slavery, but in the design of policy. By design, blacks have often been excluded from the benefits of asset-generating policies.
Right.
It's both by design and implementation. And I know I'm rambling on, I'll give 2 quick examples and I'll stop. Take the GI Bill. The GI Bill is probably the source of an American middle class, white asset-based middle class. Wasn't like a white asset-based middle class simply emerged. It was literally government giveaways that led to people having access to a down payment on a home, a debt-free college education, or some seed capital to start a business. Now, that's not a bad thing. The government should be actively engaged in providing assets for its people so that they can have economic security of wealth. What's problematic is that the Faustian bargain, in large part to get Southern legislators to go along with a Jim Crow South, excluded blacks. That was the tacit political agreement, both by design and implementation. So, what am I talking about? Social Security excluded domestic and agricultural workers, who at the time, 90% of black women were in one of those fields, and over half of black men. Or you could take the GI Bill, which was administered in a local Jim Crow context, so you can imagine it was racially disparate. It was administered also in a context where there was not housing expansion because of discrimination, so HBCUs as an institution were not able to grow in the same way that a place like the University of Michigan was because of local housing discrimination. So it is economically just, if we're ever going to get over our racial barriers, to redress this, and that is why reparations is so critical, particularly in the domain of wealth.
Ali, could you follow up on that and talk about the connection between wealth and health? And you kind of addressed some of that already.
Right, so there is what you call a direct positive correlation, meaning there's a one-to-one correlation, a one-to-one relationship between wealth and health. When black people lose wealth, they lose health. It is not just that they get sick, they also don't have the ability to respond to illness in the healthcare system. One of the main forms of bankruptcy is healthcare bills, okay? So we start there, and we can also talk about something that I studied, that children who grow up in neighborhoods where minorities are more likely to get access to unsustainable loans. This is the contemporary forms of redlining. They're less likely to be able to breathe. Asthma. They're more likely to not only have asthma, but they're more likely to grow into asthma. This is between the ages of 0 and 18. So very young children are more likely to have asthma, more likely to have acute physical symptoms like stomach aches, migraines, and so on and so forth, colds and flus, which are, in fact, they're common children-counted problems, but you're more likely to have those problems at a young age when your brain needs the most fuel to develop. The last thing I would say is that we need to think about the Great Recession. The Great Recession had a very strong impact, not just on black people's wealth, but on the wealth of black communities. We're talking about the neighborhoods here. There is a relationship between subprime mortgages and foreclosures. Foreclosures and wealth and health, okay? So we know that in neighborhoods where there were more foreclosures, there are also more health problems. Those foreclosures are linked to subprime loans. Those subprime loans are linked to, in earlier decades, the lack of access to mortgages, and all of that is linked to the broader issues of wealth.
So related to this discussion is who is eligible for reparations.
There we
So
go.
a slavery-centered reparations argument
Yes.
that the descendants of American slaves should be the beneficiaries of reparations in this country. However, nearly 10% of blacks in this country are immigrants. Should they be eligible for reparations? Especially if we think about reparations as restoration for accumulated discrimination or disadvantage. So I might surprise the panel a little bit. I'm gonna start with Darrick on this one.
She tried to put me on the spot and get me in trouble. I see people filming out there. She tried to set me up. So obviously, this is not necessarily an easy question. In a technical sense, if you're designing good public policy, you find the intended the intended recipients, and if we're framing it in an injustice frame, we identify the injustice and identify, well, who withdrew the injustice and how do we redress that? Now, one other point is that reparations is not just for slavery. Reparations would go, frankly, one could make an argument about reparations for mass incarceration. I separate that from a reparations argument because I don't want to dilute reparations. But I certainly would argue that reparations did not end with slavery. It would include the New Deal as an example of things that need to be redressed. So it wouldn't simply be recipients of African slavery in that frame. And then let me also go back to the argument I'm making about designing policy. So when designing policy, those that suffered the egregiousness would be redressed. But also in policy, you end up in scenarios where in application, everyone who's designed to receive the benefits don't always receive the benefits. And likewise, everyone who's not designed to receive the benefits do receive benefits. And sometimes we call that a moral hazard. So there's a trade-off. There's a trade-off in, if we had some criteria, we are very good at keeping data, so it is likely that we can come up with scenarios in which most people that would qualify as having ancestry through slavery we could identify and redress. But in reality, I bet there will be some that we don't. However, there is the risk that you reward people who otherwise might not have been intended to. So I guess I'm giving a long-winded, nuanced answer to say that there would be some consideration about whether you want to not include some people that shouldn't be included by technical definition, not the argument about people that immigrate to the U.S. and whether they should receive reparations is some people argue they self-selected into a racially discriminatory environment.
Yes, they
but
did.
let's really dissect that word self-selected. If you're fleeing oppression, I'm not so sure it's self-selection.
No,
but nonetheless,
no.
It is nuanced and complicated. And then there was one other point I wanted to end on, and I'm forgetting it. That means I'm rambling on. Maybe it'll come back.
Sure.
Okay.
So, I think there are a couple of questions that get raised from this.
I'm not-
The contemporary sort of framing of discrimination would also implicate people who are newly arrived in this country, right? So it's not that your being an immigrant is going to shield you from redlining, it's not going to shield you from surveillance, it's not going to shield you from violence. And so, yeah, maybe some people didn't partake in American slavery, but they certainly partake in modern day American discrimination.
Okay,
And
so
the
still
argument to
doesn't qualify.
refute that from the people that advocate that they shouldn't receive reparations is that, again, the argument of self-selection, that they self-selected, but again, the notion of self-selection could be further interrogated. I mean, another point is that we're talking about 10% of the black population. So I think some of the estimates is that about 90% of the black population, people that identify as racially black or would have some ancestry back to slavery. So again, I used to be of the frame that it would only be those that went through slavery, but I'm questioning that, and I'm questioning that from I really don't know the answer. I think a lot of these questions we raise ultimately are going to require a full-throated commission to actually redress these, because it's not a simple answer.
Well,
It's
it
not a
is.
simple answer
I
for
can
many
answer
of the
that.
reasons I mentioned.
Mm-mm,
And like I
not
said,
included.
if indeed some people benefit that otherwise shouldn't have benefited. Now, here's who I don't want to benefit. We know that we've had